I will begin. Okay. So the police now the police have always been part of our society for so long that it's easy to accept them as a presence that's always been there. But this isn't the case. London was the first city in the world to have a modern police force when Conservative MP and then Home Secretary Robert Peel passed the Metropolitan Police Act in 1829. Up till that point, the closest thing to police were watchmen, who were volunteers led by a parish constable who was elected to an unpaid position. Another role that was popular at that time was a thief taker. And again, this was someone employed by a fee-paying member of the public to catch criminals and present them before a magistrate, similar to like the US bounty hunters. And these people later found employment in recapturing runaway slaves. In his book, Beyond the Limits of the Law, Tom Bowden points out that the police are asked to do the impossible. As fellow citizens, they are employed by the state to ensure that the state is not subverted either by crime or certain types of political activity. So the police were a creation of the state to protect the interests of the ruling class, a task, as mentioned, either fulfilled by private individuals or by the army that were sometimes called in. Incidentally, another reason for not relying on the army came out when the army was called to deal with civil unrest in 1919, when the then Secretary of State, Winston Churchill, called in the army to Glasgow to deal with strike breakers during the Battle of George Square. So at that time, Scottish soldiers were locked up in the nearby Maryhill barracks in case they sided with the striking workers. So before the Metropolitan Police Act, similar style policing could be found in British colonies around the world, including Britain's oldest colony, Ireland. And a quote here from Captain W. White on the formation of the new police force. This quote is from 1838. So the latent object appears to have been that of placing at the disposal of the Home Secretary a body of well-trained, disciplined and armed men, competent to intimidate the public and to keep down the rising spirit of the population. At the time of its inception in the 19th century, central to the role of the British police force was to keep the peace, public order. It was a priority which, for long periods of relative prosperity and social calm, could safely be pushed into the background, replaced by the myth of policing by consent. The real nature of the British police force was bound to resurface as it did in the face of the recession and Thatcher's class divisive government in the 1980s. The process of building a paramilitary force with the police had to begin in earnest following 1981 and the inner city riots in Brixton. In particular, the police were hard pushed to deal with concerted opposition. Lessons had been learnt in the north of Ireland and in other British colonies, which now had been put into practice in mainland Britain. Led by ex-RUC Chief Constable, Metropolitan Commissioner Sir Kenneth Newman, the Association of Chief of Police Officers, ACPO, in close collaboration with the RUC and the Hong Kong police, who were notorious for their riot squad, began equipping the police to deal with the seriousness of social discontent. The watershed came in 1984-1985 miners' strike, which we'll be going into more detail later, which closely followed by the 1985 uprising of Toxteth and Broadwater Farm. Out of their experience of policing these events, new legislation in the form of the Police Criminal Act 1984 and the Public Order Act 1986 increased police powers. By 1987, at Wapping, the police had polished their riot procedures and established a communication system with an armoury to match. Their proficiency was tested again during the 1990 poll tax demonstrations in London, and again a minor scale Welling in 1993. All the paraphernalia now in place, the cavalry charges and the short and long snitch squads, helicopters, cameras, communications, and the media ready to pursue the hue and cry afterwards. Since the minor improvements, like extra long truncheons, have prepared their readiness to meet social disorder with bloody physical repression. So to conclude, police brutality is part of the systemic racism in Britain, in the country, that needs to be dismantled in a way in which the ruling class used power to create fear through divide and rule. One example of British Empire. Sorry, everyone getting this so far? Just because I'm jumping between reading and this. So bear with me just a sec. So an example of the British Empire, which is glorified in the country, which in reality white Brits went to foreign countries, specifically targeting Africa, and they stole from these people, forced their cultures, beliefs and their way of life onto these people, and if they dared rebel, they were tortured and killed. So to this day, the British government funds and campaigns specific people to get into power, and in certain places like Africa and Kenya, they tell these people how they should rule their countries, and most of the time the people suffer. So it's ridiculous that the police only get 6 months of training. This was something that was actually mentioned on the March last week. They only get 6 months of training to become police officers, with numerous things that police officers have to respond to, serious situations like rape and assault. They're not trained enough to deal with these things. They should also, there's no procedures in place to make sure that, you know, the people that are racist aren't being employed by the police force. And just, you know, to finally just sum up here, to go back to the book that Bowden wrote, the police are regular citizens with imposing the law onto their fellow citizens, and this power creates a layer of privilege between the police and the rest of the population, since they know that the lawmakers of this country are going to side with them against the rest of the population. Now, this is the quote that I knew I'm going to mess up here. Remembering the Latin saying, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Now, it's translated in several ways, you know, who watches the watchman or who guards the guardsman. Now, some people call for the police to be defunded, but keep in mind that their budget has been stripped away since the 2008 banking crisis, so that they're already losing money. It doesn't, you know, stop them from being racist. And for those that are wanting to get a more progressive, you know, government and parliament, remember, as part of last year's Labour manifesto, they were wanting to increase the police budgets. So the police are here to enforce the country's laws written by the elite. Until we have true democracy, where the laws are written by the people for the people, we must fight for socialism, and in doing so, fight racism, fight imperialism. Thank you.